You're listening to The Culture Pop on Lab Stack. The story of Red Shambhala seems more like something out of an Indiana Jones movie than an actual piece of history. But the quest to find Nirvana drove a passionate few Soviets in the 1920s to remote regions in Mongolia and Tibet. Joining us now to tell us about this forgotten tale in Soviet history is Andrei Znamensky. He is the author of the new book, Red Shambhala, Magic, Prophecy, and Geopolitics in the Heart of Asia. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be at your show.
So, quite an amazing set of tales, and thinking about this convergence between communism and Buddhism and all the things in between. First, let's start off and explain what Shambhala is or was and its place in Eastern religion.
Okay, yeah. To make a long story short, Shambhala is a Buddhist prophecy that emerged in early Middle Ages. When Muslims advanced into Afghanistan and northern India, they dislodged the Buddhists from these areas, and the Buddhists had to find a safe haven somewhere. So they came up with the spiritual resistance prophecy that was identified with the land, the utopian land. So it's a kind of Buddhist paradise where the members of this faith would be free to live, worship, without being harassed by barbarians, whom the Buddhists called the Mleccha people, or in other words, the people of Mecca. So the legend of Shambhala claimed that somewhere in the north there was a mysterious country, a land of plenty, where people lived 900 years, where they were rich and had houses with roofs, clad in gold, and where nobody suffered, and of course, where the Buddhist religion existed in its pure form. So it's a concept of a Buddhist paradise that was attractive to local people, and in modern times, it became an object of interest on the part of Westerners who wanted to promote their geopolitical schemes.
This idea of paradise at times was more something of a physical thing that people believed in, but then I guess morphed into being more of a metaphorical thing.
Originally, I argued that it was an actual physical place where Buddhist people could escape from the Muslim advance. But eventually, of course, as it always happens, it became a spiritual utopia. Okay, so when, for instance, Tibetan and Mongolian people had to fight against the Chinese in modern times, they used recycled the same legend about the Buddhist paradise to fight against the Chinese. Okay, and it's interesting that in modern times, since the legend placed the paradise somewhere in the north, there were some Buddhist monks who linked the legend of Shambhala to Russia, to Tsarist Russia. One of them, for instance, Agwan Dorji, who was a tutor for the 13th Dalai Lama, he argued that it was Tsarist Russia and the Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, who was the king of Shambhala. So salvation of Tibetan Buddhist people would come from the north. Of course, it was a geopolitical scheme because Tibetan Buddhist people wanted to enjoy Russian help against either the Chinese or other, as they thought, enemies of the faith.
And it was also, I guess, ulterior motives that drove some within the communist Russia to look to Shambhala and these spiritual practices for their own gains in the 1920s. I'm thinking of someone who you described as the Red Merlin, Alexander Barchenko. Can you tell us about him and how he came upon these practices and what his visions and goals were?
Let me briefly describe my book to give listeners an idea what it's all about. It's a series of short essays, but these essays, biographical essays, but these essays are linked to each other by the major theme, the quest for Shambhala. So I profile a few people who were obsessed with this legend or wanted to use it somehow. So the first two persons, and the one of them you mentioned, it's Alexander Barchenko, an occult writer from St. Petersburg, and his friend, Bolshevik secret police cryptographer Gleb Boki, who was one of the spearheads, actually, of the October Revolution. That's an interesting thing. And another group of people whom I write about is a famous couple, Nicholas and Helena Roerich, who also were looking for Shambhala. And another person who is profiled in this book is Aglan Darjeev, whom I mentioned also. And finally, your listeners might have heard about so-called White Bloody Baron, Roman von Ungen-Sternberg, who was also interested in Tibetan Buddhism and in using the Shambhala legend for his own purposes. So I'm writing about him as well. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. Alexander Barchenko. Okay, our listeners should understand that the time I'm writing about, it's 1920s, 1930s, the time infested with these ideas of social engineering, total changes of the world. People were on the quest for grand political schemes. They believed that they could resolve all the problems once and for all if they find some kind of scheme, if they find ideology. And that's how Shambhala fit this profile. Alexander Barchenko was a writer from St. Petersburg who became obsessed with this idea to link Tibetan Buddhism to communism. And he repeatedly approached Bolsheviks, early Bolsheviks, offering his services. He wanted to organize expedition to Tibet to do what? To retrieve this knowledge, okay? Because he believed that Tibetan Buddhism is a collectivist concept, pure spiritual teaching that can be linked to communism. How? He was upset that there was so much violence in Russia, the civil war, and the bloody revolution. So he was concerned about how to reduce the level of violence. And he believed that if you bring Tibetan Buddhism into communism, that's how you can mute this bloody violence that was so popular, unfortunately, at that time with people. And he found his patron, one of the bosses of the secret police, Gleb Boki, who provided him money. They set up a secret lab in Lubyanka, in downtown of Moscow, where Barchenko had his neurological lab, where they conducted experiments with Tibetan lamas, shamans, all kinds of clairvoyants, magicians. So it was an interesting episode.
And looking at Barchenko and Gleb Boki and what they were trying to do, they were also trying to spread the idea of communism into these other places. That was one of the reasons why they were funded, right? So it was the idea that Mongolia and other parts of Asia could be the next recipients of communism, correct?
Excellent question. Because, see, we have to remember that Shambhala language has two dimensions. Internal, inward and outward. I just described how these two people try to use inward aspects of this legend, like changing, programming the mind of the person, making the person better. But at the same time, Shambhala language, as I said in the very beginning, it was a spiritual process, a resistance basically against infidels. The Bolsheviks in Mongolia, they made a conscious attempt to connect this legend to the process of communism, which brings to light another interesting thing, that the religious background of the whole idea of communism. Okay? So I'm sure some of our listeners know that communism, as it existed in Soviet Union, was a form of secular religion, okay, with its own